Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for preachers and all other lovers of the Hebrew Scriptures. I'm Tim McNinch.
And I'm Rachel Wren. This week we'll be covering Jeremiah 1, the lectionary text scheduled for August 25th, 2019. Now we're taking a break from our little Shopkins-sized mini episodes to bring you a full-size Barbie Dreamhouse episode with a special guest exegete.
That's right. We're so pleased to have with us today Dr. Brent Strawn. Brent taught for a few years at Asbury Theological Seminary, and then for 18 years at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, where he was the William Ragsdale Cannon Distinguished Professor of Old Testament. Rachel and I were both fortunate to catch his final courses here at Emory before he left for his new post at Duke Divinity School. Thanks to Brent, we know more about the ancient Near East and its theological world than we could have ever asked or imagined. Brent is ordained in the United Methodist Church and is a prolific preacher, author, and speaker. He served both as a translator and a member of the editorial board for the Common English Bible. We would personally recommend to you, our listeners, his book, The Old Testament is Dying, A Diagnosis and Recommended Treatment. We kind of see this podcast as trying to address some of the issues that Brent elucidates there in that book, and hopefully we're giving the OT kind of a vitamin boost and not just giving hospice care. But at any rate, we think you'll like that book, and we'll give you a link to that on our website. Brent, welcome to First Reading.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Now, you're in the process of moving over to North Carolina, and just wonder, how's it been? Are you feeling a little bit of separation anxiety from all of your books?
This is true. I did. I couldn't part completely, so I have to admit I brought 6 boxes with me on the road.
As we all do, yeah.
3 were shipped and 3 came in the car with me. There were certain projects that needed to get done. So far, I think, though, about 7 or 8 weeks into this road trip, I've only maybe worked through about 1 box worth. So, alas.
I feel a lot better about myself then, because my husband always makes fun of me for how many books I bring on vacation, and so now I can tell him that up to 6 boxes is reasonable.
Before we started, though, I just wanted to say, in light of the intro, if this is Barbie size, does that make me Ken? Because I've always kind of had a man crush on Ken. Though I have to say, I'm disappointed. I don't think there's ever been a bald Ken.
We'll let you be whoever you want to be in that imagination. All right, Brent?
I appreciate that.
And if it's any consolation, I think that Ken's hair is painted on anyway.
That's true. That makes me feel better. Because that's not beyond my reach, or beyond what I might actually do.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's great.
Well, why don't we get into our lectionary text for the week? Brent, would you be willing to read it for us? We're looking this week at Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 to 10.
Sure. Yeah, here it is in the Common English Bible translation. The Lord's word came to me. Before I created you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I made you a prophet to the nations. Ah, Lord God, I said, I don't know how to speak because I'm only a child. The Lord responded, don't say I'm only a child. Where I send you, you must go. What I tell you, you must say. Don't be afraid of them, because I'm with you to rescue you, declares the Lord. Then the Lord stretched out his hand, touched my mouth, and said to me, I'm putting my words in your mouth. This very day I appoint you over nations and empires to dig up and pull down, to destroy and demolish, to build and plant. There ends the lectionary reading.
Word of the Lord. So now, with the first few verses of the book of Jeremiah, which we don't get in this assigned lectionary passage, they say that Jeremiah has started his career during the reign of the Judean king, Josiah. So what's significant about that era of Judean history? What should we know about the historical and political context of Jeremiah to really understand this passage?
Well, a couple things. I mean, you all know this as well as I do, that Josiah is an important king in the book of Kings and in the history of Judah, because he's really one of the few bright points in the history of the monarchy. Josiah is the only person in the whole Bible that instantiates the Shema, the love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. He's said to do this like no other, including the great David or anybody else in the New Testament for that matter. No New Testament references claim that for anyone. So he's really a high point, and so Josiah is a good guy according to Kings. The question that's raised by the Jeremiah superscription is the chronology of the prophet vis-a-vis Josiah, and this has been a problem in Jeremiah scholarship because Jeremiah is pretty much down on Judah for most of the book, and this seems to sit oddly with Josiah, who is supposedly this great king. So the question is kind of, when did Jeremiah start his ministry? Did he know about Josiah, and basically was he quiet during that time, supportive of Josiah, and then after Josiah, does he then get into it, or is he unpleased during the reign of Josiah? So there's some complicated chronological questions there, but Josiah is clearly portrayed in Kings as this wonderful king, and presumably he and Jeremiah would be majorly simpatico on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd think so. Mm-hmm. And the particular text that we're looking at here it's a call story, so it sort of fits almost a literary form of this prophetic call story. Can you give us a little bit of a way that this compares to other prophetic call stories, and how that might help us to kind of see what's going on in this text?
Sure. So this does follow a kind of set literary pattern, and that's has been used, to go back to the previous point, by some to say, well, these are not, these can't tell us anything individually about the prophets because they're set literary forms. And yet, set literary forms rarely are identical, and therefore there's a little bit of, novelty here and there. And the novelty here and there says something about that particular literary form, of course, but perhaps also that particular religious experience or engagement or something. So
I just want to draw that out a little bit before you continue, because I think it's really important. Some people think that the Old Testament is a little bit boring because it has these repetitions in it, or these forms that you talk about. But at the same time, like you said, the way that form is utilized and deployed can tell you something about the intention. There's interesting ways to see the distinctions between these forms, which tell us something about what the prophet is trying to communicate. So I wanted to lift up that point. I think it's really important.
Yeah, totally. I think that's exactly right. That's sort of the dirty little secret of form criticism. The obvious secret is, wow, these are kind of literary forms that they knew, like they understood that a tweet could have only so many characters, or a business letter had to have these sorts of elements. They had these too, but the dirty little secret is no two forms are exactly alike, and the distinctions are revealing. Yeah. So in terms of these prophetic call narratives or forms, they're not always narratives. Like this one's not a narrative; it's a poem. They've been studied by a number of people, particularly Norman Hobble in a well-known essay, and I think it was 1965, back in the late Bronze Age, and they have elements that correspond across the board, and they kind of include things like the divine confrontation, where the deity engages the individual, and the introductory word of some sort, and then a commission, followed by an objection. The prophet never wants to be called, and so always objects to the call. And then there's a reassurance that the divine figure offers to the objection, and then finally a sign. So these elements occur, and they occur with regularity, with such frequency that you can really identify it as a literary type. And it occurs in everything from Moses in Exodus 3 primarily, but extending into 4, Gideon in Judges 6, Isaiah in Isaiah 6, Jeremiah here, Jeremiah 1, Ezekiel 1 through 3, and even in the Annunciation to Mary in Luke chapter 1 follows I would say, an identical form.
I love that. I love that you brought that up. I've never really thought of or heard of Mary talked about as a prophetic figure, but to put her Annunciation story in this literary form is fascinating.
Yeah, and it follows to a T. I've talked about it briefly in a little thing I've written years ago on the call form, but I've always wanted to come back to it, though I recently discovered an essay that I think gets at it, so it may have already been done, and so maybe I don't need to do that, but I've always wanted to write a little piece on that, especially from an Old Testament perspective. There's all these New Testament people poaching on the Old Testament. I think it's time the Old Testament people start poaching on the New Testament. That's what I say. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that is the form. Yeah, that form is there, and Jeremiah's call has all these forms in it, but also some interesting tweaks and little ticks, as it were, that are Jeremiah's own.
Yeah, what are those? What stand out to you as sort of the ways where the form gets bent a little bit?
There's two primarily, I think, there's more than that, but two that I think are particularly important that go back to your initial question, Tim, about the nature of this particular prophet and maybe his relationship with the Lord. And it has to do with the way Jeremiah objects to his call. And it's kind of a famous text because it has this line in it, I don't know how to speak because I'm only a child. In Hebrew, this is na'ar. And this child line is really kind of famous. And, of course, it's given rise to all kinds of wonderful junior high school, ministry messages, or late elementary school or maybe high school, with scholars frequently opining, too, that this na'ar must be about 12 years of age or 13 years of age or what have you. So Jeremiah objects like Moses. Moses, in one of his final objections, says, I'm slow of tongue, or I don't know how to speak well. So in some sense, Jeremiah picks up on that, but no one says something like this, I'm a na'ar. So the question is, and it's related, as you can see, to the superscription issue. I mean, how young is he when he's called? Is he just an infant during Josiah's great revival, or is he called as a young boy aware of Josiah but doesn't actually get going till later? How old is a na'ar? That's the question. But he's the only one who does this little additional element. And they all say, no thanks. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Right? That's what Moses says. Isaiah says, how long, O Lord? That's his objection. I want out. But Jeremiah says, oh Lord, he's got lament language here with this Hebrew word, and that's in Hebrew it's great. It's kind of like, because it's almost onomatopoeic with English. Is aha, aha, no Lord, aha, oh no, please, Lord, not me. I don't know how to speak because I'm only a boy. So that's an interesting little element, and then the corresponding additional element in the Lord's response is when God says, don't say I am only a boy, because where I send you, you will go, and what I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid. Fear not. This is kind of this is an oracle of salvation language. Fear not from them, for I am with you to deliver you. So a number of things that go on in God's response also go beyond anything God says to the other prophets. God doesn't ever say, do not fear to these prophets, except Jeremiah, in this particular form. In this flow of the form. Also, this to deliver you is a plus that's not found elsewhere. So God does promise to be with people. Like, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? I will be with you, right? And this is the sign that I've sent you, is what God says to Moses in Exodus 3. So these little elements that God adds seems to correspond, in my judgment, to what Jeremiah has done by claiming to be a na'ar. And I think when I first started working on this passage, I worked on this passage, I have to say, way back when as an undergrad. I wrote my senior thesis project in college on the prophetic call narratives. But I didn't see this then. I only saw it later, not long after I started teaching at Emory, and I was reading an essay by my own professor, my own dissertation advisor, Pat Miller, on prayer as persuasion. And in it, he makes this comment that rhetorically, a lot of prayers are trying to persuade God, of course, and one of the ways they persuade God to act is by claiming low or subservient status, because prayer in Israel trades, among other things, on the notion that Yahweh cares about people who are little and insignificant and weak and wants to help them. So I suddenly, kind of 2 and 2 hit together. Pat doesn't talk about Jeremiah 1, but I was thinking about Jeremiah 1, and I thought, what about this not our business? Maybe this doesn't have anything to do with Jeremiah's chronological age. Maybe it's a rhetorical move by which he claims low status. So if you probe na'ar a bit in Hebrew, you find out that it's notoriously nonspecific. We don't know when someone stops being a yeled, a child, and when they're a na'ar. And we also know that na'ar is used in stereotypical fashion for full-on adults.
Right.
The servants of the king call themselves na'ars. They're na'arim. They're servants. They're not boys. They're grown men, presumably. They're going to be advising the king or taking care of the king, etc. And nowhere is this even clearer, I think, than in 1 Kings 3, when Solomon himself says, give your servant wisdom in his prayer because I am only a na'ar. And he actually adds, just to be even further, I'm a little na'ar. Well, he's old enough to be king. He's probably not prepubescent. You know what I'm saying? So the na'ar thing could just be stereotypical, could purely be a rhetorical move. And I think that makes sense in light of what follows, in which case you got to give it to Jeremiah, right? He's not stupid. It's like he's seen or knows or maybe even read, who knows, these previous call narratives. And he's like, yeah, when the dude calls, don't pick up, right? I mean, when the dude calls, go straight to voicemail, or because once you start talking to him, this is what Jonah does, right? Just go straight to voicemail and head to Joppa. Vacation.
Do you think he took 6 boxes of books with him?
He probably did. He probably did. So Jeremiah says, though, once you start talking to the Lord, you can't get out of these calls. There's no getting out of these calls unless you do something better than these other guys have done. These other fools didn't know who they were dealing with. I know who I'm dealing with. So I'm going to not only object to the call, I'm going to object with one of the most strongest appeals ever. And God's going to have to relent, right? God has special concern for these lowly, these little, these weak. Oh, Lord, no, I don't know how to speak, because I'm only a na'ar. And he kind of puts down the little, ace on the table right then. We're out, we're done. I'm pretty sure we're good here. But what he learns is even that's not good enough, right? And so if what he's done is, in terms of the literary form, bent the genre a little bit. He's not just objecting, he's lamenting, and he's lamenting with really the strongest rhetorical appeal that Israelite prayers had. He's bent that response a little bit generically. What he finds is that God is pretty good rhetorically too.
Yeah, right.
God's like, I see you, but I got a full house or whatever. Whatever trumps that. And what God responds with is nothing less than an oracle of salvation. No longer just a promise of presence, no longer just a reassurance, but an oracle of salvation. This al-tirah, do not fear, is often used oracle of salvation language. It's got a wartime background, it seems. This is like, I'm going to be, fighting right next to you or with you, and then no one else gets this. I am with you to deliver you. That's a plus too.
Yeah.
So and then you round it off by this oracular formula, the oracle of the Lord. I mean, God's like, I see your na'ar, and I raise you an oracle of salvation, a promise of deliverance, and an oracular utterance. Boom, you're going. I'm sorry, Jeremiah, you're going.
Yeah, that also helps me understand a little bit. I was a bit confused by the early part of God's response to Jeremiah, and if na'ar is really a word about his low status, then God's response about the people to whom Jeremiah will be sent and the words that he'll be given is sort of like your own assessment of your status is insignificant. The status that you have is the status I'm giving you, not the one that you're coming with, and that's what's significant here.
I like that, and so the reassurance element, which is what God's done here, though God's bent the genre as well, does always have some increased divine activity, some sort of helpful response, and you have it, of course, in "Do not fear" and I will deliver you, says the Lord. But I think your point is right on, because it's saying, you will go wherever I sent you. You will say whatever I speak. In other words, it's going to happen. You don't have to like worry about it, in a sense, right? And in Hebrew, the verbs of commissioning, I will send you, you will go, does actually front the divine agency first, which I think plays into the notion of reassurance, divine reassurance, that God's agency is usually elevated in the reassurance to help the prophet work through.
Now, you've said that the form is kind of standard. The God calls, the prophet says, "No, Lord, not me." But what would it have been about this particular historical situation that might have caused Jeremiah to try to pull back so strongly? What was so scary about the situation to which God was calling Jeremiah?
That's a great question. I think it probably depends on the chronology somewhat, because if he gets called during the reign of Josiah, maybe nothing. Maybe it's just the nature of the prophetic task as such, right? None of the prophets want to be prophets, and this is a stereotypical element. Everyone who gets called as a prophet in the Bible doesn't want it. And this is a useful point that I say in classes a lot of times. If you ever meet somebody who says, "I was so thrilled to be called," maybe you weren't called really, because especially the prophets, they always end up dead before their time with no one to collect the life insurance, right? So, it may be formulaic. It may just because the gravity of the prophetic call. Jeremiah is really almost the longest of the three major prophets. I think Ezekiel's longer, if I remember right, in terms of number of words. But in a long ministry, and of course, as we continue to read, we can then deduce, well, he's in the middle of the Babylonian furor, right, and fervor, and the destruction of Jerusalem, and he's on the wrong side of the politicos. He favors Babylon, and he's in jail all the time. And if he didn't have that family named Shaphan always backing him and sneaking him out the back door, he would have been dead even earlier than he was. So maybe that's part of it too. Maybe he already, if he's not 5 years old when he's called, and without watching the CNN feed, if he's older, he might not be stupid, and he might realize the threat Babylon poses on the horizon, and that he's going to get into it. He's going to be in the middle of it.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point to lift up too, simply because as Christians and as preachers, when we read the Old Testament texts, especially the prophetic texts, it's so tempting to jump immediately to applying it to our life experience without taking into account the fullness of the context of whatever the text might be. And I think one of the things that I would lift up about this text is just how grave the situation was, eventually anyway, that Jeremiah gets called to. That this is not necessarily your Tuesday morning at the post office is God calling me to speak text. Like this is a text for life situations where the stakes are higher.
Yeah, definitely. And that's the difference between maybe a prophetic call and a pastoral one, right? Or a teaching one or something else. I mean, the stakes are considerably higher. They're life and death. And if we read closely, a lot of the prophet, not only in the objections, but sometimes there's hints here and there that they're not happy thereafter as well. The end of Ezekiel's call, he says, I went away from the Lord bitter and deeply angry. That never hit me until recently when I was rereading his call in 3:14. He's kind of pissed, and I don't know if it doesn't say exactly what he's pissed about, but God has told him he's going to be, have this super hard head and he's going to be okay, but he's mad anyway, what I mean? And I think he's mad because of having to do this task, right? And Jeremiah gives us similar hints later in the book. So I think what Jeremiah does, and this goes back again to kind of the idiosyncrasies of the prophets, if not actually, or the prophetic text, if not actually their personalities, he never seems to make full peace with it, So according to the prophetic call forms, when you get called, once you start talking to God, you end up getting talked into it. Even Jonah, who doesn't talk to God initially, gets spewed out, vomited conveniently right on the door of Nineveh. It's remarkable how it works that way. But with Jeremiah, he's something anticipatory here with his a lamenting, I don't know, and pay attention to me. I'm only a little tiny insignificant person. You shouldn't be calling me. Because again, he has later in the book these famous texts that are called the Confessions, which are really laments of the prophet to God, where he is, lamenting, complaining about his prophetic ministry. Chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 20. There's a number of these things, depends on how you count them. But the last one happens in 15, and there is the last time God responds to him about these complaints. He keeps going in 20, but God doesn't respond anymore. But in 15, when he complains about his call, God just says, hey, look, if you stop uttering worthless words, I'll take you back. Quit talking about worthless stuff. Get on with it, right? These people will turn to you, not you to them. And then God says, I'm going to make you a sturdy bronze wall. They will attack you, but they won't triumph because I am with you to rescue you. So God's like, remember the call, Jeremiah, back to chapter 1. That oracle of salvation, it still stands. And God doesn't talk to Jeremiah, according to the book, directly, again, in terms of this response to his calling. Because I think God said everything God needs to say. I can't give more than an oracle of salvation. I'll promise more than that I will save you. That's got to be good enough. And Jeremiah evidently works through. But with the case of Isaiah or Moses or Gideon or Mary, you don't really ever hear them continuing to complain to the Lord about their calling. Only Jeremiah really does that. And so all that tumultuous relationship is prefigured, is anticipated, foreshadowed already in the call narrative, which in my mind plays out to a kind of formula, if you don't mind me saying so, and that's kind of the stormier the relationship, the sweeter the communion. There's something about Jeremiah and God's relationship that is profoundly more developed and personal, including maybe more painful than some of the other prophets.
Yeah, and I think that it works kind of backwards too. We said at the beginning that we don't know how close to the prophet himself these texts would be, and it's likely or possible at least that this call narrative was written in a way in retrospect with the later career of Jeremiah in mind, and so we have some of that tension and suffering and all of that prefigured in the call narrative here, as well as the closeness of Jeremiah's relationship with God.
I think we see that in a really physical, concrete way in verse 9. When I read verse 9, the Lord put out his hand and touched my mouth, and the Lord said to me, herewith I put my words into your mouth. It reminded me of Isaiah's call narrative, but in that story it's an angel touching a coal to the lips of Jeremiah, and here it's divine God touching God's hand to Jeremiah's mouth. And so there's an intimacy that almost is like a riff on that call story of Isaiah, which highlights that like you said, the stormier the relationship, the sweeter the communion. He's touched literally by God in this moment.
Yeah, that's great. Of course, you're sounding now like a German biblical scholar, and that the Jeremiah is just a pastiche of all kinds of previously existing texts and a scribal creation.
Forbid that. Let me stay where I am in my lane. But it is interesting.
No, but I think that's right. The touching that happens in Isaiah 6 with the coal is earlier in the call form. It seems to have to do with it's what enables him, as it were, to suddenly hear the divine word. And so that's another, I think, point that supports your point that in this advanced, objection 2.0 and then the reassurance 2.0, that part of that reassurance 2.0 includes this direct contact by God. And of course, it's also a little bit later in Ezekiel as well, right, when he eats the scroll. So, I love that. I think that's exactly right. And you could see these sorts of echoes, if they are intentional literary echoes, to be along the lines of what Tim said, that maybe, and scholars have said this, maybe these intros, these prophetic call forms are intentionally designed in some ways as introductions to these books. The kind of fly in the ointment there is Isaiah 6, which doesn't occur in chapter 1, right? It comes in chapter 6, which then leads to speculation about, is it a call narrative or not? And is it, what does that say about 1 through 5? And anyway, that's
Welcome, dear listeners, to Biblical Rabbit Trails.
That's it.
Well, the other place in this text that drew my attention as far as the intimacy between God and Jeremiah is back in verse 5. And actually that verse drew our attention and our preparation quite a bit. I wonder if we could land there for a few minutes and talk about this really profound statement that God knew Jeremiah in the womb. Brent, what do you make of that? What do you think is the significance of that kind of a statement?
It's really quite fascinating, isn't it? And unparalleled in the call narratives. It brings to mind, of course, for me a little bit of Psalm 139. I don't know how much we can build off of it with some contemporary issues, theological issues, for instance, like predestination or some other matters. But reading it the way the words run, it does suggest that God's call on Jeremiah's life is in utero, right? It goes back to in utero, or even earlier, right? Origin's pre-existence of souls. He'd be so happy right now. I don't know if he alluded to this or cited this text, but you could imagine that. So this call is just so fundamental and in its point of origin, which God's kind of heavy-handed here right out the gate by saying this call is kind of really inescapable, that I've made you a prophet to the nations.
I like that you brought that up. And speaking of kind of heavy-handed verbs, can we jump to verse 10 where there's this list of active verbs and what they're doing there? God overcomes Jeremiah's objection with the oracle of salvation, and then kind of in this verse 10, what tells him a little bit about what he's going to be doing, and it's no small task, right? It's to uproot and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. How do you make sense of that progression of verbs and what it's trying to communicate?
Well, I think a couple things can be said. One is that the verbs are primarily negative, right? 2 to 1, the prophetic task is a destructive one. A critical one, a criticizing one, to use Brueggemann's prophetic imagination, kind of a dismantling. And again, this is no doubt why no one wanted to be a prophet, right? I mean, it's a major drag. It's not prosperity gospel. It's not telling everybody they're okay and that God loves them just the way they are. No, God doesn't love them. A, God doesn't love them the way they are. B, you know what I mean? And someone needs to say that every now and then, especially in the Christian church in North America, which is, according to Eric Wilson, just become happiness companies. Yeah. And he didn't mean it as a compliment. Yeah. So, the preponderance of prophetic verbiage is negative, it's critical, but there is also the 1/3 this kind of energizing, is what Brueggemann calls it, the critical consciousness and the criticizing task of the prophet, and the energizing task, the build and the plant. And as you all know, and our listeners probably do too, is that these verbs come back later in the book. They function as kind of Leitworte, these repeated words that come up to signal what Jeremiah is about and what God is about in the ministry of Jeremiah. And the book does turn kind of about halfway through, right, to a more hopeful stance. And that's the kind of sign that, now it's build and plant time after the exile. Once the destruction has been experienced, once all the pulling down and destroying and demolishing takes place, it's time to build and to plant. So the preponderance of the evidence, the prophetic ministry is negative. That's a really crucial point. And then the other one, the way these verbs anticipate the rest of the book, is also, I think, important.
Mm-hmm. I feel it's kind of heading towards some advice on how to preach a text like this, but I wanted to ask you one more question before we get there. Mm-hmm. We've talked quite a bit in our conversation so far about how this functions as a call story or a call narrative for Jeremiah, but you made a comment earlier that in fact this is poetry. And I wonder what difference that makes. I know that you've thought quite a bit about this, Brent, as far as just the importance of reading poetry as poetry in the Bible. And if we do read this call poem as a call poem, what difference does that make in understanding what it's trying to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think in one sense it might explain, I guess, two things. One's a formal and one's a matter of content. The formal matter would be, it would help us or remind us that we should pay close attention to all these words, to how they're put together, how they sound, some of the assonance that occurs in verse 5 with certain repetition of vowels, sounds. And of course, it is a kind of narrative poem, right? I mean, it tells a story. There are characters and all the rest, but it's poetic in form, and maybe all of that is maybe in service ultimately to memorability. So that's one thing. I think the second thing in terms of content, I suppose, to wonder about the episodic nature of poetry, especially in non-narrative modes. I mean, if this is a narrative poem, it's not quite as episodic as something that's more lyrical, like what we find in the Psalms. But I do think that it might suggest that, okay, not all calls have to follow the form. You know what I mean? It's like the difference between Matthew and Luke's version of the Lord's Prayer, right? When you pray, say, or pray like this. It's a difference between if it's a script or if it's a pattern to emulate. And maybe thinking about this as poetry suggests more of the pattern rather than an actual script, so that one can find themselves, as it were, in that poem about Jeremiah's call, but not necessarily having to match every single element one-to-one.
I feel like poetry that does have a narrative element to it like this kind of functions in that way where it elevates it so that it's still telling the story of that particular event, but being in poetic form kind of opens it up to being applicable to lots of different moments in this particular person's story, but also beyond the particular characters of the story, and especially theological ones like this. In a way, they're saying this is a bit of what God's like. And so you can find your way into this poem from various angles.
I like that. That's great.
I like that too, and I think it makes sense with the reference you pulled up earlier, Brent, to Psalm 139, which has some of these similarities, and I would submit too, I think has some similar kind of agony and ecstasy pieces as well. Psalm 139 is one of my first loves in the Psalter. I mean, when I discovered that as a teenager, it was like the greatest thing in the world. And then the more I read it and the more I read scholarship on it, there's elements of almost lament to it as well, where God's hand laying upon someone can have this terrible effect as well. So, I think you're right on there, Tim and Brent, that this sort of the poetic form opens this story up to some resonances that we might not hear otherwise.
Yeah, I think so. That's great. That's really nice.
So as we move toward some advice for preachers who would be interested in taking up a text like this, since it's landing in the lectionary in a couple weeks, to be able to preach from this text, one of the things that we like to do in our podcast is to highlight some areas that might be pitfalls or sort of exegetical or preaching pitfalls, sort of easy roads to take that might lead to a dead end. And what we just were talking about kind of comes back to me here, where it's important to try to find the ways that we can see ourselves in a text like this. But I wonder how we do that, like, for example, in this text talking about calling or vocation in general, how do we do that without losing the specialness of Jeremiah's own prophetic calling? That feels to me like a little bit of a tricky road to navigate. Do either of you find that too?
Yeah, I think that is an important thing. It's probably especially preachers might identify too much with Jeremiah. I mean, not wrongly, but maybe identify, and maybe people in the pews wouldn't. I think at that point we'd have to do a little bit of work towards the sort of the priesthood or in this sense the prophethood of all believers. Luther's notion that every Christian has a vocation. Not every vocation is an ordained one, but or more generally, to parrot the New Testament, these things were written also for our sake, for our instruction, according to Paul. So I think that's something that maybe the preacher has to do a little bit of work with, and maybe no longer assume, especially because perhaps the lay people might be inclined to think I'm not Jeremiah, or conversely, that I have to be Jeremiah exactly, right? So I think I would, like you say, valorize Jeremiah, and yet at the same time, these moves he makes are very human moves that we can resonate with. The distress he feels over tasks that he doesn't want to do. This is, let's be face it, this is why we suck at being Christians, is because we don't really want to do the things we know we ought to do. And so that's it seems to me a point of major connection. Rabbit trails that I think go awry, which is kind of inordinate attention to the chronology of Jeremiah, how old was he, et cetera. This is something that preachers care about because they've gone to seminary, where some seminary professor like me has taught them that that's where the juice is, but it's really not. The juice isn't there. The juice isn't about how old he was. In fact, it could be completely wrong-headed if na'ar is a non-specific term that's only there for rhetorical purposes, not for anything with regard to how old he was. Because, again, a lot of people, and well, Methodist, the average age of a Methodist is 60-something, right? Past the na'ar stage. So, that could be a rabbit trail that misses the point, that kind of really makes the text only about Jeremiah. How old is Jeremiah? Where was he? What did he have to eat on Tuesday? Who cares, right? We want the text to be about somehow the life of faith, with Jeremiah as a paradigm that we can emulate to some degree, or who is not maybe not even somebody we emulate, but who already anticipates us in some way. Our struggles with faith, our avoidance of calling, our distress at God's hand on our life.
Yeah. Yeah, I had a similar instinct, which was to take one of two forks in the road, and the one is to assuming that your congregation does in fact identify with Jeremiah. The second assumes that your congregation doesn't in fact identify with Jeremiah. So in the first one, I said, if you think your congregation might identify with Jeremiah, that might actually be a preaching angle to start by drawing out those initial shallower connections to our lives, and then interrupting that train of thought and asking them to sort of pause it and put a pin in it, and then really emphasize the high stakes nature of what Jeremiah was about. So leading your congregation to identify with Jeremiah's situation, and then really leading them to realize how dangerous the job was that Jeremiah was doing, that speaking truth to power got Jeremiah in trouble in really big ways. And so that this text is for people who might be at a fork in their lives, who might be at a crossroads, and who might be facing an ethical dilemma that has serious consequences. That's one way to go. My second preaching angle is for people who don't identify with Jeremiah, and maybe even don't like Jeremiah because they don't want to hear truth spoken to them. We always like to be the ones who are speaking truth to power. We don't necessarily like to be the power that is hearing truth spoken. So what if you were to flip it on your head and talk about who are the people in your lives who are speaking truth to you that you don't want to hear, and that they might be God ordained in some way, or God sent in some way, in a way that you really need to hear, and to use Jeremiah in that way as a wake-up call for your congregation.
I like that a lot. And it kind of helps, goes back to Tim's point about the porous nature of the poetry allows one to kind of enter it more than one way.
Yeah.
And your last point there, Rachel, makes me think of the fact that, especially in Jeremiah is where we learn that if you're going to act the prophet, if you want to have a decent run at it, you need to have some people who are willing to back you up and get you out of tight spots. The prophetic task is, on the one hand, inaugurated by the deity, but in some sense, not to be completely realpolitik about it, but it's facilitated by an environment that can hear the prophetic word, or by people who will back the prophet up. If a pastor wants to venture into the prophetic, that is, they better have some Shaphanites in the crowd who are going to back him or her up when the Shinola hits the fan after service, right? So that the pastor's not solo. Because if the pastor's solo, she's probably going to end up in stocks all night.
Yeah. How about you, Tim? What'd you come up with for preaching angles?
Yeah, I think the one that stood out to me in preparation and then in our conversation goes back to Jeremiah's objection to the call and his sense of being a na'ar. Even in our conversation here today, I felt like, man, the older I get, the more na'ar I feel.
Yeah, right?
And I can kind of identify with that in the desire to downplay my own skill or ambition towards whatever calling is coming my way. And I think that might be something that a preacher could preach from, a call to a congregation to not underestimate what God can do through them, because it doesn't depend on their skills or their level of ambition or necessarily their level of education or charisma. That the call of God comes to the prophet or to any of us because of what God knows before we were even formed in the womb. So it's all dependent on God's grace and God's calling and God's power to accomplish whatever it is that we're being called to. To me, that felt like the seed of a sermon.
Ah, amen. You're turning Lutheran on me, Tim. I like this. I like this a lot.
Well, and kind of in that same vein, that whole notion of how Jeremiah objects in this way, that honesty about his na'ar status, or maybe he's making it up, but his honesty about his insignificance and smallness elicits an even better response from God. And, I just think that the average, maybe I'm wrong about this, I hope I'm wrong, I think the average North American churchgoer has no conception of how honest they can and should be with God, and how poor, thin, and miserable their religious experience is because they're not honest with God. So.
Yeah, and just to riff on that too, that's often modeled by pastors and preachers. So how honest and vulnerable in a safe way we can be with our congregation will maybe help elicit that from people as well. So
That's right.
Oh, fun. Well, that sounds like a great place to end our conversation, and this has been really wonderful to talk with you about this text, Brent. So thanks so much for coming on the podcast with us.
Thanks for having me. I'll still keep out hope for a Old Testament bald Ken doll. But until then, it was just great to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me on, and to keep up the great work, y'all.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Brent. A note to you all, our dear listeners, if you would like more information about Brent's work and what he's done, remember we'll post a link to his book and his bio on our website, firstreadingpodcast.com. Until next week, I'm Tim McNinch.
And I'm Rachel Wren. Happy preaching.
Hey friends, a couple little postscripts to this week's episode. First of all, we want to give credit to Blue Dot Sessions for the music behind Brent's reading of this week's lectionary text. And then we wanted to give you a heads up that this dip into the first chapter of Jeremiah is just the first of several weeks in a row in Jeremiah in the lectionary. This would be a great opportunity to craft a little sermon series that follows the prophet through a variety of passages in the book. We'll be here each week with some insights for you, and we'll be closing out our own series in Jeremiah with the inimitable Dr. Carol Newsom, who will be our guest in just about a month. If you've been doing a lot of sort of ping-pong around the scriptures with your sermons, then following one book for a while like this could be a nice change of pace for you and your congregation, and really build some momentum as you spend some time with one of the Bible's most colorful prophets. We hope you'll give it a go. Anyway, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.